The sun hung low on the horizon, casting a muted amber light across the streets of New York as Alice stepped out of the yellow taxi. Her eyes scanned the towering apartment building before her, an intimidating structure wrapped in the pulse of the city's never-ending hum. The building had always been her last choice, but with nowhere else to turn, it had become her only refuge. The sign by the entrance read, "The Westbrook," though the word had faded from neglect, much like the building itself. Alice took a deep breath, feeling the familiar weight of city air clogging her chest. She'd spent months searching for somewhere, anywhere to escape her grief, to escape the incessant pull of the memories that haunted her. The death of her sibling, the life they'd built together, had broken her, leaving her adrift in a city that seemed as lost as she was. But now, standing in front of this building, Alice had one clear thought: start over. Just start over. The building's interior was a stark contrast to the vibrant streets of New York. Dim lights flickered overhead as Alice passed through the lobby, the walls adorned with peeling wallpaper that screamed for attention but was ignored by time. The elevator groaned as it took her to the 5th floor, the ding of the doors opening sounding too loud, too unnatural in the silence. She was greeted by the apartment door, the one she'd signed the lease for earlier that week. It was an odd thing really how quickly she'd secured the space. No other potential tenants had shown up when she toured, and the landlord had been overly eager to hand over the keys, as though he couldn't wait to rid himself of the place. The apartment itself was cramped but functional. A small living room, a separate kitchen, and a single bedroom. Alice hesitated for a moment as she set her bags down. The walls seemed to whisper, faint murmurs that felt like something other than the usual creaks and groans of an old building. She shook her head, dismissing it as nerves. There was a faint scent of something old in the air, musty wood and damp stone. It wasn't unpleasant, but it lingered, clinging to her like an unwelcome guest. Strange symbols. As she started unpacking, Alice's fingers brushed against the wall next to the kitchen counter, where an inexplicable gouge in the paint caught her attention. She stepped closer, squinting at the marks. They were crude, almost frantic, as if someone had hastily scratched at the surface, desperate to communicate something. Lines intersected in jagged angles, forming shapes that might have been random, but something about them felt deliberate. The more she examined them, the more they seemed to watch her, as if the very wall itself held a secret that wanted to be discovered. The symbols were too intricate, too deliberate to be the result of a careless tenant, yet Alice tried to dismiss them. Probably just some leftover graffiti, she thought, shrugging off the chill that had crept into her bones. But as she unpacked the final box, something gnawed at her. A sense of déjà vu creeping slowly, as if the apartment wasn't just an unfamiliar space but one she had stepped into without knowing it. She wiped the sweat from her palms and went to the counter to grab a bottle of water. Then, in a split second, the realization hit her. The marks on the wall were not random at all. They were identical to the symbols she'd seen in Victor's artwork, the artist who had recently sold her some of his eerie drawings. His dark, surreal art had always unsettled her, but she had never truly understood why. Now, standing there, she realized the truth. The haunting wasn't something historical, something from the past. It was ongoing. The spirits weren't only tied to the apartment. They were tied to her. Her pulse quickened. She wasn't just in an old building with a sordid past. She was in a place where the past was still alive, still lingering like a ghost waiting to reclaim what it had lost. She wiped the back of her hand across her forehead, trying to brush away the dread building inside her. It was an unsettling feeling that had nothing to do with the apartment's age. No, something far deeper was at play here. The phone call. Just as the tension in the air began to tighten, the shrill ring of her cell phone shattered the quiet. Alice jumped, startled, and immediately glanced at the screen. She froze. The caller ID displayed a name she had not seen in months. It was Tom, her sibling. Her stomach churned, a rush of nausea flooding her chest. Tom's number had been dead for over a year. Alice had buried him, buried the memory of the night he died in that accident. He was gone. He had been gone. She was sure of it. But here was the number, glowing on her screen as if mocking her very sanity. It's a mistake, she told herself, her hands trembling as she swiped to answer. This is a glitch. A mistake. She brought the phone to her ear, her voice barely a whisper. Hello? Static crackled on the other end. A faint, broken whisper lingered in the silence, but it wasn't Tom's voice. She strained to hear something, anything, but all that met her ear was the eerie hum of dead air. Then a click, followed by a harsh silence. She pulled the phone away and stared at the screen, heart racing. The call had ended as suddenly as it had begun. Alice's throat tightened as she held the phone in both hands, staring at the name. Her breath came in shallow gasps. What just happened? She was sure that the phone had not been wrong, that the number displayed had been correct. The silence in the apartment seemed to grow louder, the walls pressing in. Her mind raced. Was it a spirit? Some kind of trick? Or had she truly gone mad from the weight of her grief? But no matter how much she tried to rationalize it, the eerie sensation lingered. Something was wrong here. The call felt too real to be a glitch, too precise to be dismissed. A moment of clarity. The phone call felt like a mark on her soul. Her eyes darted around the apartment, her mind desperately trying to pull together the threads that didn't quite match up. She could feel it now, the presence in the apartment, invisible but undeniably real. She was not alone. She would never be alone. A cold shiver ran down Alice's spine. She had heard stories of haunted places, ghosts that lingered in the walls, memories that refused to die. She had brushed them off, dismissed them as superstition. But now, with the symbols on the wall and the phone call that defied reason, Alice was no longer sure what was real. The apartment, the city, her grief, it was all connected. The spirits had found her. And it seemed that they had been waiting for her. Alice awoke to the sound of soft tapping on her apartment window, the daylight still muted by the heavy curtains she had failed to draw the night before. The sleep she had managed to catch was restless, interrupted by the nagging presence of the apartment's strange energy. Her mind kept returning to the phone call from Tom, the unexplainable symbols on the wall, and the gnawing sensation that something was deeply wrong in this place. Her first instinct was to do what she always did, ignore it, to dismiss the unnerving thoughts and push forward. But the more she tried to focus on unpacking and settling in, the more the whisper of the apartment called to her, growing louder with each passing minute. She had been in the space for less than 24 hours, but it already felt like a lifetime. By noon, Alice had made up her mind. She would confront the landlord about the symbols on the walls, the odd phone call, and the increasingly strange atmosphere. Maybe there was a logical explanation for the eerie happenings. Maybe the old building was just playing tricks on her, a warped reminder of the city's long-forgotten history. The landlord's office. The building manager's office was tucked away at the back of the lobby, behind a heavy door that creaked on its hinges when Alice pushed it open. The room smelled faintly of incense, with thick velvet curtains blocking any light from entering. A large, wooden desk sat at the center, its surface cluttered with papers, old keys, and a solitary lamp casting dim amber light across the room. There was an unsettling stillness here, as if the room itself had been trapped in time, much like the rest of the building. Behind the desk, the landlord sat, his posture rigid and straight-backed, as though his body had long since forgotten how to relax. His face was pale, almost waxen, with sharp features that made him appear older than his years. His hair was white, slicked back, and his eyes, dark and piercing, followed her every movement. Alice took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm despite the discomfort prickling along her skin. She couldn't ignore the sense of dread rising in her chest as she approached the desk. "I wanted to ask you about something," Alice started, her voice steadier than she felt. "I noticed some strange symbols in my apartment, and I was wondering if you knew anything about the history of the building. Maybe past tenants, anything unusual that might explain it." The landlord's eyes flickered for just a moment, a flash of something unreadable crossing his face. Then, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, he leaned forward and steepled his fingers. "No history of hauntings here," he replied smoothly. "You're just in an old building. Mississippi old buildings have quirks, I suppose. But there's no need to worry about it. A little bit of paint and some new wallpaper, and you won't even notice anything strange." Alice felt the tension in the air, thickening with each passing second. The landlord's calm demeanor only made her feel more unsettled, as if he was too calm. His voice had no real warmth, no sincerity, just a flat, practiced ease. "I was also told by the leasing agent that the building had been recently renovated," she continued, narrowing her eyes as her gaze wandered over the disorganized desk. "Is that true?" The landlord's fingers twitched ever so slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Renovated, yes, in some parts. But the building itself? It's been around a long time. Some things don't change. And that's for the better, isn't it?" There was something odd in his tone, a heaviness to his words, as if he were choosing them carefully. Alice's stomach twisted, but she pressed on. "I've heard rumors about a tragedy that happened here years ago," she said. "A murder, that the building is haunted." She felt a chill creep up her spine as the words left her mouth. The landlord's expression darkened. For a moment there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Was it panic? Or perhaps irritation? He cleared his throat and stood abruptly, his movements stiff. I'm sure it's just stories from the past, Mississippi. Nothing you should worry yourself about. The city's full of old rumors. You'll see with time this building will grow on you. Alice frowned. There was something about his reaction that felt off, as if he was trying too hard to maintain control of the conversation. Just then she glanced down at the desk and noticed something even stranger. A ledger sitting open, but the pages were blank. The paper wasn't yellowed with age like the rest of the documents. It looked brand new. A strange sense of déjà vu crept up on her. She'd seen this ledger before, though she couldn't remember where. Before she could inquire further, the landlord's phone rang, a shrill sound that cut through the quiet. He held up a finger, motioning for her to wait, and turned his back to answer it. Alice waited, glancing around the office. She felt a strange pull to the back of the room, near a door that appeared to lead to a narrow hallway. It wasn't locked, but before she could move toward it, she heard the landlord's voice rising suddenly. It was louder, more urgent than before. "No, no, not now," he muttered, his voice trembling. Alice's heart raced. She was about to ask him if everything was okay when, without warning, the office door slammed shut in her face. She jumped back, startled, and the smell of incense filled the air, thick and almost suffocating, as though the room itself were exhaling. The moment felt unreal. Her mind struggled to piece together the moment, to comprehend what had just happened. She reached for the door handle, but the latch had clicked shut with a finality that sent a cold shiver through her. Alice's stomach tightened. The landlord wasn't there anymore. She could hear him on the other side of the door, but he was distant, as if he'd vanished entirely. It had only been a few moments, but the air felt different. She could no longer hear the faint sound of breathing or the rustling of papers. She was alone. Taking a deep breath, Alice turned to leave, her fingers trembling as she placed her hand on the doorknob. When she stepped back into the hallway, the smell of incense still clung to her clothes, a strange scent that didn't belong. The mysterious neighbor. Later that evening, the strange occurrences continued. As Alice walked to the kitchen to prepare dinner, she heard what she could only describe as faint footsteps, the soft scuff of shoes dragging on the carpet. The sound wasn't coming from her apartment, it was coming from the hallway outside. At first, she hesitated, assuming it was another tenant returning from work. But when she glanced through the peephole, her breath caught in her throat. The door to the apartment next to hers, the one that had been vacant when she first moved in, was wide open. Alice's heart skipped a beat. She had seen the apartment during her initial walkthrough, and it had been completely empty. So why was the door open now? She stepped closer, her curiosity pulling her forward against her better judgment. The soft sound of music playing inside, something old, almost from another time, caught her attention as she slowly approached the threshold. The apartment, when Alice peered inside, was a snapshot frozen in the 1970s. The furniture was garish and outdated, floral print armchairs, wood paneling, faded wallpaper. The air smelled faintly of old cigarettes and dust. The entire apartment seemed as though it had been untouched by time, frozen in a distant decade, as though it hadn't been lived in for decades. Alice blinked, unsure if she was seeing things. She had seen the apartment before, had even looked inside the windows, and it was completely barren. But this was an entirely different world. Everything was perfectly arranged, as if someone had just stepped out. As if the apartment were still occupied, even though the landlord had assured her no one had lived there in years. A cold wave washed over Alice. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with something she couldn't explain. Time was slipping, warping in ways that shouldn't be possible. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the music stopped. The apartment fell silent. Alice's pulse quickened. She stepped back, her heart hammering in her chest. The door to the apartment next door was still ajar, but the inside was now eerily still. She didn't wait to see more. There was no need to investigate further. She knew that something had changed, again. The apartment, the landlord, the strange symbols on the walls, it was all connected. And Alice was no longer sure she was just a bystander in this twisted web. Alice's hands trembled as she opened the door to her apartment the next morning. The world outside her window was shrouded in fog, a dense haze that swallowed the city's towering skyline, blurring it into a sea of indistinct shapes. The air felt thick with something unsettling, as if the atmosphere itself had been altered, weighed down by the heavy presence that lingered in the walls of the building. As she stood there, the events of the past few days replayed in her mind like a warped film reel. Victor's haunting drawings, the phone call from Tom's number, the disappearance of the landlord. And then there was the apartment next door, the one frozen in time. But even more pressing was the gnawing feeling that something, or someone, was watching her. She couldn't shake the sensation that the spirits had become aware of her presence, that she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Every corner of the apartment seemed to hold a secret, and with each passing hour, she grew more consumed by the dread that twisted in her stomach. The knock on her door broke her from her thoughts, sharp and urgent. Alice's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened the door, she found Victor standing there, his face pale and hollow, his eyes wide and full of an almost unnatural intensity. "Victor?" she asked, her voice tentative. She hadn't seen him in person since their last meeting, when he had shown her his unsettling artwork. His presence now felt different. The air felt colder, the silence between them heavier. Victor stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his gaze flickering nervously behind him as though he were checking to see if someone, or something, was following him. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice low and urgent. His hand gripped the edge of the door frame, knuckles white with tension. Alice closed the door slowly, locking it behind her. "What's going on?" she asked, her stomach knotting with unease. Victor looked around the room, his gaze resting for a moment on the symbols etched into the walls. His lips twitched, a strange grimace crossing his face. For a moment he didn't speak. Then, in a voice that barely above a whisper, he said, "You've seen the signs. The things that mark this place. The symbols, they're just the beginning." Alice felt a chill crawl up her spine. She didn't want to believe it, didn't want to acknowledge that everything she had experienced so far was part of something far darker than she could comprehend. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. "The woman," he continued, his voice growing more strained. "I've seen her. I've spoken to her. I was with her before." Alice stared at him, confused. "What do you mean, before?" Victor turned his gaze toward the floor, and Alice followed his line of sight. His eyes softened, though a tremor passed through his body as he spoke. Her name was Eleanor. She was the one who died, the one the curse was meant to trap. The way he said it, trap, made Alice's blood run cold. The room suddenly felt too small, suffocating, as if the very air had been poisoned by the weight of his confession. I was in love with her," Victor whispered, his voice cracking. "And I was the one who helped perform the ritual that cursed this building. I didn't know what we were unleashing. I thought it was just an experiment, a way to connect with something beyond. But we were fools. The ritual, it was wrong." He paused, his expression growing haunted as he met her gaze. "I didn't know the cost. The woman, Eleanor, her spirit was bound here, trapped by the curse. And for years I've been paying the price." Alice's heart pounded as she tried to process his words. You helped curse the building?" Victor nodded, a haunted look crossing his face. "Yes. I thought I could control it, control her spirit, but I was wrong. She became something more, something angry. She's been tormenting me ever since, whispering to me, trying to get me to finish what we started, to set her free." His voice grew quieter, as if the very act of speaking the truth made it more real. "I didn't come here to hurt you, Alice. I didn't. I thought maybe if I warned you I could stop this. I could stop the curse. I'm sorry, so sorry for what I did." Alice took a step back, her mind reeling. Victor had been part of the curse? The thought left her breathless, her mind struggling to make sense of the twisted pieces falling into place. Everything that had happened to her, the symbols, the strange occurrences, had been because of a ritual Victor had been involved in? You're telling me that you're the reason this is happening to me?" Alice's voice trembled with a mix of fear and anger. Victor nodded, looking at her with those hollow, remorseful eyes. "Yes, I was weak, Alice. And now she's coming for both of us." Alice swallowed hard, her throat tight. She didn't know whether to believe him, or if he was just another part of the madness, trying to pull her deeper into this nightmare. But something about the rawness in his eyes, the pain in his voice, made her want to believe him even though every part of her screamed to run. "I can't stop it. I can't escape her," Victor said quietly, almost to himself. "But you can. You're still alive, Alice. You can break the curse if you know how." Alice opened her mouth to ask him how, but before she could speak, a strange sensation washed over her. The room seemed to shift, the air growing thick and suffocating. And then, with chilling clarity, she realized something that made her blood freeze. Victor was standing too still. His presence felt wrong. She looked at him again, studying his face, trying to ignore the feeling growing inside her. The unease gnawed at her, sharp and persistent, like a whisper in the back of her mind. The coldness in the air felt heavier, thicker. She could feel the pressure closing in. "Victor," she said, her voice trembling. Are you alive?" Victor's eyes flickered, the faintest smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. But it wasn't a smile. It was something darker, deeper. "You don't understand, Alice," he said, his voice suddenly distant, hollow. "I've been dead for months. I've been dead since the day I performed the ritual." Alice recoiled, her heart slamming against her ribs as she stumbled back. "What? No, that can't be right." But as the words left her mouth, the truth hit her like a tidal wave. Victor's face, his form, his very presence, it was wrong. There was something spectral about him, something unnatural. She had seen it from the very beginning, but now it was undeniable. The man she had been talking to was not alive. He had been dead all along. "I'm here," Victor continued, his voice low, almost pitying, "because I'm bound to this curse just like you. I tried to warn you, to help you, but I failed. It was always too late." His eyes darkened, a shadow flickering across his face. "I'm the messenger, Alice, and I'll be here watching as the curse unfolds. You won't escape it." Suddenly, without another word, Victor began to fade. His body lost substance like smoke dissolving into the air. Alice stood frozen in place, unable to speak, unable to move. And just like that, he was gone. The room was silent once more, the echo of his voice still reverberating in her ears. Alice stumbled back, her mind reeling. Victor had been dead? He had been manipulating her all along? She gasped for air, her chest tightening as the reality of the situation settled in. The warning he had given her, was it real? Was it a way to redeem himself, or had it been another manipulation to trap her further? The apartment felt colder now, the presence of the spirits heavier than before. The walls, once merely ominous, now seemed to close in on her, their whispers growing louder. Alice knew with certainty that the curse wasn't just on the building, it was already beginning to consume her. The night felt endless, a heavy, suffocating blanket that wrapped itself around Alice as she paced the apartment. Her mind was a storm of confusion and dread, Victor's cryptic warnings still reverberating in her ears. The mystery of the building, the strange symbols, the ghostly apparitions. It all felt like too much for her to handle. But the one truth that had remained undeniable was that she couldn't run anymore. The curse had already started to unravel, and she was tangled in its threads. She glanced at the clock. It was just past midnight. A silence filled the apartment, thick and oppressive. But that silence didn't feel safe anymore. It felt like the calm before something violent, something inevitable, something wrong. The room suddenly chilled, and Alice's breath came out in a visible puff. Her heart thudded in her chest as the temperature dropped further. She froze, instinctively sensing that someone, was about to appear. The air grew heavy, thick with anticipation. The door to her bedroom creaked open by itself. Alice's pulse quickened. She didn't need to look, she already knew what was coming. The presence, the one that had haunted her dreams and thoughts, was now here, real and tangible, like a dark cloud rolling in. With a slow, deliberate movement, Alice turned to face the room, and there, standing by the window, bathed in a ghostly, unnatural light, was the woman she had been avoiding. The woman she now knew was no mere specter, but a force tied to her very existence. The air grew so cold that Alice could feel her teeth aching from the sharpness of it, as though the temperature had plunged into some forgotten place between life and death. The woman's figure shimmered, translucent yet solid, her dark eyes locked onto Alice with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The long, flowing dress the spirit wore seemed to billow in an unseen wind, and her pale face, once beautiful in life, was now twisted with a sadness and fury that radiated from her every pore. "Alice." The ghost's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it echoed throughout the room as if it was being spoken by a dozen voices all at once. "It's time you remembered." The words sent a shock through Alice's body, and for a moment she stood frozen, unable to breathe. She wanted to run, wanted to flee, but her feet felt rooted to the floor. Her heart pounded in her chest as her eyes refused to leave the ghostly woman. There was something about her, something inexplicable and terrifying. "What do you want from me?" Alice managed to say, her voice shaky, barely a whisper of its usual strength. "Why are you here?" The woman's lips curled into a twisted smile. "I've always been here, Alice. You just never wanted to see me." Her voice grew deeper, almost mocking. "You can't hide from the past forever." Alice's mind raced, trying to comprehend what was happening. There was something familiar about the woman, something deeply rooted in her own memories. She felt an instinctual pull, like a part of her soul was recognizing the figure before her, even though she had no idea why. The ghost slowly stepped forward, her ghostly form floating closer with every passing moment. You were just a child when it happened, but you've buried the truth deep within you. Do you remember? The air around Alice thickened as the ghost's presence became overwhelming. Alice felt her breath catch in her throat. What do you mean? Her voice faltered as she began to feel something clawing at the back of her mind, trying to break free. A memory, half forgotten, bubbling to the surface. But it wasn't a simple memory, it was something darker. The ghost took another step forward, and suddenly the world seemed to spin around Alice. The apartment melted away, and a vision overtook her, of a different time, a different place. It was as if she had been transported back into her own past. She was a little girl again, standing in the hallway of the building, her building, but it was different. It was brighter, newer. The walls were fresh with paint, the air warmer. She heard laughter, but it was distant, muffled. There were shadows lurking around every corner, and a sense of something wrong in the air, a tension that she couldn't quite understand. Then the vision sharpened. Her mother's face, familiar but worn and filled with a sense of dread, emerged from the fog of the memory. The image was clear now. Alice's mother was standing near the very spot where Alice now stood, but her expression was one of terror, as if she was trying to escape from something, or someone. Suddenly Alice saw it, him. The man her mother had been running from. He was standing there too, his features obscured by shadow, but his eyes gleamed with malice. He was holding something in his hand, a knife, its edge gleaming with the promise of violence. The vision shattered, and Alice gasped for air, her chest tightening as her heart raced. The ghost's voice echoed in her ears. Do you remember now, Alice? You were here when it happened. You've always been here. Your mother? She was the one who died, but she wasn't the first. We were the first victims. The couple you found in the attic, they were connected to your family and to the curse. Alice's legs felt like jelly as she stumbled backward, clutching her chest. The weight of the revelation was crushing. Her mother, the murdered woman, had been her mother. The memory she had buried so deep in her mind, the trauma, the grief, it was all tied to this cursed building. Her mother had been killed by the very man who had cursed the building. The curse, the ghosts, the ritual, it was all connected. No, this can't be real, Alice whispered, her voice trembling as she sank to her knees. The ghost, now more solid and defined, knelt before her. She reached out a translucent hand, her fingers brushing against Alice's cheek. You're the key, Alice. The only one who can end this, if you can face what you've buried. Alice's head spun, the weight of the ghost's words pressing down on her. Her mind raced as she tried to process everything. The truth of her past, her mother's death, was the reason the curse had latched onto her. It wasn't just her presence in the building. It was the blood that ran through her veins, the blood that tied her to the tragedy that had begun all those years ago. The ghost's form began to flicker as if the energy sustaining it was fading. You're the only one who can break the curse, Alice. But you have to face what you've forgotten. You must remember everything, the truth that lies in the walls of this place. As the last words echoed in Alice's ears, the ghost vanished, leaving behind nothing but the haunting silence of the apartment. Alice sat there in the darkness, trembling as she tried to piece together the fragments of her past. She had been drawn back to the place where it all began, where her mother had died, and now she had no choice but to confront the truth she had repressed for so long. The curse wasn't just on the building, it was tied to her, to the bloodline, to the secrets buried in the past. The walls seemed to close in on her once more, but this time she wasn't alone. The ghosts were with her, speaking, haunting her, urging her to remember. The air in Alice's apartment had grown unbearably thick, charged with a suffocating energy that pressed down on her chest. She had been awake for hours, unable to sleep, unable to silence the relentless pounding in her mind. The ghost's cryptic words from the previous night kept echoing, swirling around her thoughts like a dark cloud, urging her to seek out the truth buried within the very walls of the building. Her skin tingled with the heavy sense of something important and terrifying that was waiting to be uncovered. Her instincts told her the answers were close, within the apartment itself, and so she began to search, methodically tearing apart the room. Every object, every loose floorboard, every crevice in the walls felt like a potential clue, a piece of the puzzle she had yet to solve. But with every passing minute, the place seemed to close in on her more and more. As her fingers brushed over the peeling wallpaper in the corner of the living room, a hidden seam caught her attention. With trembling hands, Alice peeled back the paper, revealing a small compartment behind it. A strange chill swept through the room as she pried the hidden space open. Inside, nestled between yellowing pages and old fabric, was an old leather-bound diary. Her heart raced as she picked it up, the weight of it sending a strange ripple through her chest. She hesitated for only a moment before flipping open the first page. The handwriting was meticulous, elegant, each word carefully inscribed. She could feel the presence of something ancient, something dark, pressing against her as she read. The diary belonged to a man named Edmund Hollis, the building's first tenant. The more Alice read, the more the sense of dread grew. Hollis had been a practitioner of occult rituals, a man who sought to bind spirits to the physical realm in exchange for unimaginable power. The deeper Alice read, the more disturbing the details became. One passage made her stomach churn. The ritual is nearly complete. To gain true dominion over this place, I must offer the life of one bound to my bloodline. A sacrifice is necessary. The chosen one will be the final piece of the puzzle, the life of my flesh and blood, to cement the power and bind the spirits forever to the land they haunt. Alice's pulse quickened as she reached the final, horrifying line. The ritual will be completed with the death of my daughter, and through her sacrifice, I shall unlock dominion over the spirits trapped here, binding them to me for eternity. Her breath caught in her throat as a cold wave of realization washed over her. Her bloodline. Alice's chest tightened, her fingers trembling as they gripped the pages. The ritual had been meant for her. Her own family, her own ancestors, had been part of this curse. The walls of the apartment seemed to close in on her, and for the first time, she truly understood the depth of the horror that had been passed down through generations. Before she could process the full extent of the revelation, the room around her began to shift. It was subtle at first, a quiet shift in the air, a distortion in the light. Then the apartment itself seemed to come alive in a horrifying way. The walls, once solid and familiar, began to warp and groan, stretching and twisting like the flesh of some grotesque being. The air grew thick, heavier than before, and an unsettling hum filled the space. Alice stumbled backward, her pulse thudding in her ears. She tried to speak, but no words came out. Her eyes darted around, unable to grasp what was happening. The furniture began to rotate slowly on its own, chairs spinning in place as if moved by invisible hands. The room felt like it was breathing, the walls undulating like a living thing, and Alice could hear faint whispers, soft and insistent, coming from the very wood and plaster around her. Next. The word sent a chill through her, the faintest echo of something malevolent, something ancient, pressing against her mind. Then, as if the apartment had a mind of its own, the walls shifted further, the once neutral wallpaper now peeling away to reveal grotesque images. They weren't just strange patterns, they were faces, twisted, contorted faces of her ancestors. Each one leered down at her, their expressions filled with malice, as though they had all conspired in silence to bring her here to this moment. Her bloodline, Alice thought again, her mind racing. She could almost hear the whispering coming from the walls themselves. It was as if the spirits within the building were speaking directly to her, their voices joining the hum that had grown louder, more distinct. Then a sudden searing pain exploded across her skin. She cried out, clutching her arms as a strange symbol, an intricate, foreign design, began to appear on her forearm. It burned like a brand, the skin beneath it writhing as if the symbol was not just ink but a living thing, eating into her flesh, etching its mark into her very being. The symbol pulsed, and with each pulse, Alice felt herself sinking deeper into the nightmare-like version of her apartment. The sound of her ancestors' whispers grew louder, more urgent, until they drowned out all other noise. The apartment seemed to stretch and twist even further, the air now thick with dread and malevolence. You are the next, the final piece. The voices of the dead seemed to chant in unison, rising in volume. Their collective power vibrated in her bones, and she could feel herself losing control. The walls, the whispers, the very space around her were closing in. Suddenly, the apartment lurched violently, as though it was shaking under the weight of an unseen force. Alice staggered, her legs buckling beneath her as the world around her spun into chaos. The room shifted in and out of focus, the furniture becoming distorted, the images of her ancestors mutating into grotesque, snarling figures. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, the apartment fell silent. The furniture froze mid-spin. The walls stopped shifting, returning to their original form, albeit now scarred and twisted by the unnatural occurrence. The burning sensation on Alice's skin subsided, but the symbol remained, dark and distinct, forever etched into her flesh. Breathing heavily, her heart still hammering in her chest, Alice stumbled back to her feet. The room had returned to normal for the cursed building at least, but she was no longer the same. She could feel the weight of the curse bearing down on her like never before. She had been marked. She wasn't just a part of the haunting anymore, She was its key, its next victim. She looked down at her arm, where the symbol still burned faintly under her skin. A sense of foreboding washed over her. The ritual had begun, and she was now the one trapped in its cycle. With no time to lose, Alice knew that the truth she had uncovered in the diary was only the beginning. The walls had whispered their warning, and now it was clear. If she didn't find a way to break the curse, she would be the next sacrifice to complete the ritual. The streets of New York felt different now. Alice could sense it in the air, an unnatural stillness, a heaviness that seemed to press down on everything around her. The city's heartbeat, which had once thrummed with the energy of 1,000 souls, now seemed muted, distant, as if the very life of the metropolis was being drained away. The curse that had once been contained to the apartment building had spread. She didn't know how it had happened, but it was clear now. The darkness had seeped into the streets, taking root in the very fabric of New York City. At first, it had been small things. A strange fog rolling in at night, a man on the corner who spoke to shadows instead of people, the faint, almost imperceptible whisper of voices when the wind blew. But now, Alice began to hear stories from people she met, strange encounters that were too consistent to be mere coincidences. The city was changing, the supernatural force had stretched far beyond the building, and it was feeding off something darker, something deeper. Her thoughts raced as she stood at the subway entrance. She had been tracking down any possible lead to break the curse, but now she had to see it for herself. She couldn't escape this nightmare anymore. It had grown too large, too terrifying, and too real. She stepped onto the platform, the usual hum of the station now feeling alien, out of place. The subway car pulled into the station with an eerie screech, the doors sliding open to reveal a group of commuters, all strangely silent. The normal bustle, the life of New York's underground, was missing, replaced by an unsettling calm. Alice took a deep breath and entered the car, her footsteps echoing loudly in the confined space. At first, it was just another ride, people sitting quietly, eyes glued to their phones, some reading, others gazing out the window. But then Alice felt it. The air grew colder, and the lights flickered in a sickening rhythm, casting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The murmurs of the passengers grew faint, their conversations distorted by an otherworldly hum. Something wasn't right. She turned to face the woman sitting next to her, a middle-aged woman in a worn-out coat, her face pale and gaunt. But as Alice looked closer, her stomach dropped. The woman's face was wrong. Her skin was discolored, blotchy, and stretched too thin, as if it were clinging to a hollowed-out skull. Her eyes were glassy, dull, and void of any light, and her mouth twisted into a grotesque, toothless grin. Before Alice could react, the woman's form began to warp, her body cracking and shifting unnaturally. Her arms elongated, her fingers curled into skeletal claws, and her clothes hung loosely around her decaying frame. The others in the car began to transform too, each one turning into the same decayed, ghostly version of themselves, their eyes clouded, their skin falling apart in sickening patches. Panic surged through Alice. She backed away, trying to push through the crowd of passengers, but her body refused to move. It was as if the air had thickened, solidified into something impenetrable, holding her in place. The whispers of the spirits filled her ears, and she heard them clearly now, their voices a dissonant chorus. "You've awakened us, you've awakened the hunger." Alice's breath caught in her throat, her heart racing as she realized what was happening. The spirits weren't just haunting her, they were spreading, feeding off the sorrow, the grief, the fear that had gripped the city. The curse had reached a critical mass, and now it was consuming everything in its path, devouring the souls of the living, distorting them into twisted, decayed versions of their former selves. The train screeched to a halt, but the door didn't open. The passengers remained frozen in place, their bodies twitching and jerking in unnatural ways as if their spirits were trapped inside their decaying shells. The air was thick with a stench of death and decay, and Alice could feel the curse pressing against her chest, suffocating her, trying to pull her into the void with them. She struggled to breathe, her mind racing. The reality of what was happening began to sink in. The curse wasn't just about her. It wasn't just about the building or her family's bloodline. It was feeding off something more personal, something deep inside her. The grief that had been consuming her since the death of her sibling, the unresolved pain that she had carried with her for so long, was the source of this power. Her sorrow, her trauma, had become the vessel for the curse's strength. And now, that strength was feeding on the city itself. "It's you. It's all your fault." The voice of the ghostly woman echoed in her mind, the realization slamming into Alice like a wave. In a moment of clarity, Alice understood. The spirits had been feeding off her grief all along, drawing power from her unresolved emotions, from the hole left by her sibling's death, and now, with the curse growing stronger, it had reached its peak. It was no longer just a haunting. It was a force, a dark, insatiable power that was consuming everything around her, turning the city into a decaying, ghostly wasteland. She could hear the screams of the passengers now, their voices distorted and desperate, but their words were indistinguishable. Alice's stomach churned and her mind raced, scrambling for a solution, for a way to stop this. Her grief had made her vulnerable, had given the spirits the power they needed to spread, and now they were claiming more lives with each passing moment. The train lurched again and Alice fell to the floor, scrambling to her feet as the doors finally opened. She darted out of the car, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The station was a nightmare. The walls of the subway were covered in the same grotesque symbols she had seen in her apartment, the same markings that had been etched into the walls of the cursed building. The station was empty now, silent. The air was thick with malevolent energy. The spirits were everywhere, feeding off the grief and pain that lingered in the city's bones. Alice's hands shook, her mind reeling from the realization. She was the key to stopping the curse, but she was also its fuel. The path ahead seemed impossibly dark. How could she sever the connection between her grief and the curse? How could she free the city from the suffocating grip of the spirits? The clock was ticking. The more she allowed herself to succumb to her sorrow, the more the curse would feed off it. But could she even live without the grief that had defined her life? With no time to waste, Alice's only choice was to face the question head-on. Could she embrace her grief, confront it, and break free of the curse? Or would she be forced to carry it with her forever, feeding the spirits until they consumed everything? The weight of the city's sorrow pressed heavily against Alice as she descended the staircase in the abandoned building, the same one she had once called home. Each step felt like a beat of a forgotten heart, the walls around her groaning as if they were alive. The echoes of the past reverberated in the air, each shadow whispering the untold stories of the building, stories of betrayal, sacrifice, and unspeakable pain. She could feel the spirits all around her now, closing in, watching her, waiting. The room she entered seemed frozen in time, a macabre reproduction of her childhood memories, but distorted and darkened by the curse. The wallpaper was peeling, the air thick with dust, and the dim, flickering light of an old chandelier cast eerie shadows over everything. It was here, in this very place, that her mother had been murdered, where the ritual had been completed, where the curse had taken root. Alice had spent so many years trying to forget, but the ghosts of the past were unrelenting. The time had come for her to face them. She didn't know how she knew, but Alice could feel their presence. They were waiting for her. The ghostly couple, the ones who had been trapped here for decades, had summoned her. She stepped forward, heart pounding in her chest, the stifling air choking her breath. Then from the darkness they appeared. The woman, her mother, was standing there, her ghostly figure draped in a tattered white gown. Her skin was pale, translucent, her eyes empty pools of sorrow. Her face was contorted with grief, a mixture of anger and despair that Alice could see mirrored in her own heart. The man beside her, the murderer, was dressed in the attire of a bygone era, his face a grotesque mask of pain, his eyes hollow, yet filled with an insatiable hunger. Alice, the woman's voice broke through the stillness, hollow and sorrowful, yet tinged with something darker. You've returned. And now the cycle must be completed. The curse can end, but you must sacrifice yourself. Alice's throat tightened. Her mother's eyes pierced her soul, digging into her deepest fears and regrets. This was it, the truth she had repressed for so long. The woman who had raised her had been trapped in the cycle of this curse, and now she was demanding that Alice join her in the spirit world, to become part of the eternal ritual. Alice's mind raced. How could she end this? How could she free herself from this place, from her family's dark history, without giving in to this haunting demand? We can break the cycle, Alice, the man's voice rasped like the whisper of dead leaves. But you must replace her. Become part of the ritual. You will become the conduit, the link between the worlds. You will give your soul to us, and the curse will be undone. A cold shiver ran down Alice's spine as she felt the heavy weight of the decision before her. It was the only way out. But as her heart screamed to refuse, another thought surfaced, one that made her sick with dread. What if there's another way? Suddenly she heard it, a soft, whispering voice behind her. The very voice that had been there since the beginning. Victor. She turned, expecting to see him, but what she saw made her blood run cold. Victor wasn't standing as he had in the past. He was floating, his translucent form shimmering in the dim light. His eyes were dark, empty, and his mouth twisted into a wicked smile. The same wicked smile that had greeted her with false promises of salvation. "Did you really think I was here to save you, Alice?" he asked, his voice oozing with malice. "I wasn't trying to stop the curse or protect you. I've been orchestrating this all along." Alice's breath caught in her throat. Her heart pounded in her chest as Victor's form solidified before her. He was no longer the compassionate artist she thought she knew. He was a ghost, twisted by his own selfish desire to possess her. "You think you're the one who's trapped here?" Victor continued, his voice low, each word a dagger. "I was the one who helped curse this building, who bound us all to this place. And now you're the final piece of the puzzle, Alice. Once the ritual is completed, I'll take your body. I'll become the vessel, your soul will be mine. Forever." Shock rippled through Alice as the truth sank in. Victor had manipulated her, used her grief and her desire for answers to lure her into his trap. His warnings, his supposed redemption, they had all been lies. She had been nothing more than a pawn in his twisted game. The room seemed to close in around her as the spirits of the ghostly couple loomed closer, their presence pressing against her from all sides. The ritual was already beginning. The air thickened with an ancient power, swirling around Alice, drawing her in. The woman's pale hand reached for her, fingers cold and skeletal. "No," Alice whispered, recoiling. She couldn't do this. She couldn't let them take her. In that moment of clarity, Alice knew what she had to do. She didn't have to follow the ritual, didn't have to become a sacrifice or a vessel. She had the power to break the curse, to sever the cycle of death and pain that had haunted her family for generations. Alice closed her eyes, feeling the weight of everything. The ghosts, the curse, the pain of losing her sibling, the weight of her own grief. It was all part of her, part of what had brought her to this moment. But she wouldn't let it consume her. She wouldn't let the spirits win. Her eyes snapped open, fire in them now. The darkness that had once been her greatest fear was now her strength. "I won't be your pawn anymore," Alice said, her voice steady. "And I won't let you use my grief to feed your curse." With a sudden force, Alice thrust her hands forward, pushing against the oppressive energy that surrounded her. A pulse of light, raw and powerful, surged from her chest. It was a light fueled by everything she had faced, the sorrow, the pain, the love and the rage, and it broke the curse's hold. Victor screamed as the light enveloped him, his form flickering and twisting as it was consumed by the radiant force. The ghostly couple recoiled, their forms dissolving into mist as the curse unraveled around them. Alice fell to her knees, exhaustion flooding her. She had done it. She had broken the cycle. The curse was lifted and the spirits were freed. The building, her home, was silent once more. But as the light faded, Alice felt something still linger. The weight of her grief remained, but now, it was hers to carry. She had faced the darkness, confronted her past, and chosen to free herself from it. The curse was gone, but the journey ahead was hers to define. The once familiar skyline of New York City now appeared distorted, a warping, unsettling mirror of itself. The towering skyscrapers bent and twisted like spectral shadows, stretching unnaturally into the sky. Streets that had once been bustling with life were now eerily silent, filled with fog that seemed to pulse with a ghostly rhythm. Time itself had become fluid, the boundaries between the living world and the realm of the dead no longer clear. Alice stood at the edge of what was once the vibrant heart of the city, now reduced to a fractured landscape. It was as though she had crossed into another world, one where the laws of nature no longer applied. She could hear the faint echoes of voices in the air, the whispers of the dead brushing past her ears as if calling her name. The city's skyline flickered like a fading memory, and the once bustling streets seemed to stretch on endlessly into nothingness. It was a city caught between worlds, where the living and the dead existed side by side, trapped in an eternal loop. Her heart hammered in her chest. She had thought she had broken the curse. She had thought she had freed herself from the ghosts that had tormented her, but it was clear now that she had only unraveled one thread in an intricate web of supernatural power. The curse, fed by her grief, had taken root in the very fabric of the city, and now the city itself was falling apart, collapsing into a rift where the boundaries between the living and the dead were no longer just blurred, they had merged. The streets seemed to pulse beneath her feet, as if the city itself was alive, breathing, shifting. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the scent of both forgotten memories and unburied souls. Alice knew she couldn't stay here much longer. She had to escape, had to find a way to stop this madness before it consumed everything. But the spirits, their power now magnified by the ritual, had become the city's very essence. They hunted her from every corner, their hollow eyes fixed on her, their voices rising into an otherworldly chorus. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet cracked open, the rift spreading wider. Alice stumbled backward, gasping for air as the walls of the buildings around her melted away into the void. Shadows moved in the corners of her vision, twisted faces emerging from the darkness, each one a reflection of a ghost she had encountered in the past. The murdered woman, Victor, the cursed couple, even her own family, their forms distorted and unnatural. And then, amidst the chaos, a figure appeared before her. It was the ghostly woman, the one who had once been her mother. But now she was different. Her form flickered like a broken reflection, her features contorted with agony and rage. "Alice," the ghost called, her voice no longer a whisper but a shriek that echoed in every corner of the city. "You cannot escape. The city is ours now. You are bound to us just as your family has always been. You are part of the curse, part of the darkness. You will never be free." Alice's knees trembled, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The very air around her seemed to press in, suffocating her. The city's decay mirrored her own sense of impending doom. "What if I can't escape?" she thought. "What if this is my fate?" But as the spirits closed in, a strange calm settled over her. She had been running from her past for so long, from the curse that had haunted her family, from the pain that had consumed her. But now, standing in the heart of the rift, she realized the truth. She was the one who had created this. She had shattered the curse, yes, but in doing so, she had opened a door to a new realm, one where the dead would never rest, and where her family's legacy would continue to haunt the city for eternity. The ghostly woman stepped closer, her eyes filled with desperation. "You must choose," she said, her voice now softer, almost pleading. "You can join us in the underworld, end your suffering, and become part of the spirits. Or you can stay here in the living world and fight. But know this, the city will fall apart without you. You are the one who created this. You are the one who can either destroy it or keep it alive." The choice was impossible. Alice had faced so much darkness, so many terrifying truths, but now at the final moment she felt as though she were standing at the edge of an abyss, with no clear path forward. To join the dead was to surrender, to leave behind everything she had ever known. But to fight meant to preserve a world that was already on the brink of collapse. Either way, she would be tied to this place, to the curse, to her family's dark legacy. She closed her eyes, letting the weight of the decision sink in. Her mind raced through everything she had experienced, the pain, the grief, the ghosts that had tormented her, and yet, amid it all, one thought stood out: "I can't give in. I won't." When she opened her eyes again, the city around her seemed to shudder, the air thick with energy. Alice took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment, the enormity of the choice before her. The spirits had been feeding off her grief, but she knew now that she could reclaim her power. She could choose to fight for the living world, to preserve the fragile peace that still remained. She would no longer be the victim of the curse. She would be its end. With trembling hands, she stepped forward into the rift, her heart pounding with a newfound strength. The world around her seemed to bend and twist as she reached out, her soul intertwining with the city's energy. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for the world, for the lives of the people still trapped within it. And then, in the final moment, everything went dark. When Alice opened her eyes again, the world was quiet. The rift was gone. The city had reset as though nothing had ever happened. The buildings stood tall and unbroken, the streets filled with the hum of life once more. The sky above was a soft, serene blue, and the air was calm. It was as if the horrors she had faced had all been a nightmare, a dream that had faded into the morning light. But something was wrong. She could still feel it, an undercurrent of something that wasn't quite right. She turned to look around, and there, standing in the distance, was a figure she knew all too well. Victor. But he was different now. His form shimmered, faint and intangible, as though he were part of the city itself, part of its very soul. And then Alice understood. She hadn't erased the curse. She hadn't destroyed it. She had created something new. The spirits had been freed, but in doing so, she had opened a door to a new plane of existence, one where the ghosts of the city could roam forever. And now she was the guardian of that realm. The city was no longer the city she had known. It was a city of ghosts, a city where the living and the dead would coexist forever, where the boundary between worlds had been forever altered. And Alice, standing at the edge of that reality, was the one who held the key. As the sun set over the city, she realized that she would never be the same. The curse was gone, but its legacy remained, and now she was its keeper.